my other opportunities to meet with Afghans. I also was involved in writing poetry and things in Afghanistan that was published, and I got to know the intellectuals of Afghanistan through this experience. And then as director of the Fulbright Foundation, when I became well acquainted with many of the bureaucrats of Afghanistan, many of the ministers of Afghanistan. And it provided me really with some kind of over the years at least, I didn't have it obviously in the initial experience I had, but some ability to analyze what was going on in the society and to try and obtain information about really what was developing at this time. I remember particularly that where I lived in one part of Kabul, the person who lived behind me was Nur Muhammad Taraki. He was the president of the regime that came in 1978, the first president. The man who replaced him by executing him or by killing him, Hafizullah Amin, who was also a member of the Khalq Party, lived about 2 blocks down from me in one area, and this Babrak Karmal lived just a block down from me in another direction. And then the man who was Dawood's adopted son and his closest political ally and his sort of liaison between himself and the leftists lived right next door to me. And I used to think it unusual because I really didn't understand at the time what was going on, that I used to see Dawood come to this house next door to me on a regular basis. I knew that he was related by adoption with this fellow, but it was a rather regular thing. And when this guy would leave, a number of other people would come. I recognized some of them as Babrak, etc. What was going on, obviously, and what I realized in 1973 when Dawood brought about his coup, which threw out the monarchy, threw out his cousin, the king, and brought himself in as president of the First Republic of Afghanistan, that he had been conducting at least discussions leading to the development of this successful coup, because this young man who was his adopted son became his vice president. And he also was a member of the Parcham Party. So it was an interesting thing for me because I was able to see these people in the bazaar, to talk to them. I knew of them a little bit. I used to go to poetry reading soirees with Nur Muhammad Taraki, who's quite a literate individual. And so I had an opportunity to see these individuals and develop a certain kind of feeling for the kinds of leaders that they prove to be or to not to be. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of all of this is that Dawood himself really believed that he would have the undying support of the Parcham wing of these two Marxist parties. And he was able to come in with them in 1973 to throw out the king. And it was not indeed a large popular uprising. It was, again, a military kind of coup. And so he came in, and after a period of time, sought to purge these various leftists from his government because he was recognizing that through the leftists, the Soviet Union was exerting power on and influence on Afghanistan to a degree where Afghanistan was unable to sort of direct itself in its own economic and political matters. For example, they discovered world-class deposits in chromium and copper in the eastern part of Afghanistan and offered out bids for its development to the world, and a number of private corporations from Japan and France and India competed with the Soviet Union's government consortium for the right to the exploitation or the exploration of these deposits. The bid was won by the Japanese as the most favorable. The least favorable was that of the Soviet Union. And yet within a year, it was the Soviet Union was prospecting in Afghanistan and actually developing these particular resources. I was later told by the foreign minister under Dawood, who was a very close personal friend of mine, that it was because of the pressures that the Soviets exerted upon Afghanistan, indicating that they would no longer provide military supplies, etc., that they were forced to go along these ways. So Dawood sought to remove himself a bit from these leftists. And as a result, the two leftist parties that I indicated before that had sort of spread apart because of personality differences in 1977 combined. And they were able to combine to the point where in 1978, in April of that year, they had a bloody coup in which they ousted Dawood and executed his family in much the same kind of scene. If any of you have seen the movie Nicholas and Alexandra, the kind of death brought to that family the same kind of death that the Romanovs experienced. The Afghan royal family, or they were no longer the royal family in political terms, but at least most of these people were still from the royal family, at least the family of Daoud, had gathered in the presidential palace in the dining room, and they were all executed there, save one, a young woman who now lives in Washington, who witnessed the execution of her husband and 3 children. So she is able to give us at least a personal witness to that tragic event in the life of that particular family. So we are faced with that particular situation in 1978, and I personally feel that the Soviet Union was as surprised by this particular turn of events as many people in Afghanistan and the United States were. The Soviet Union actually had been getting along very well with the Afghan government. Things were going very well for the Soviets in their relationship with Afghanistan, and I don't think that they really had any intention at that time to combine with the Afghan Communist Party to bring about this particular coup. But the individual who was most successful in bringing this about was Mr. Amin, who was educated, by the way, at Columbia University in New York. And he was a very clever organizational genius. And he was able to bring in just a few people to use the military to effectively bring about this coup that became a very bloody one in the suppression of the opposition that developed against it over a period of the 3 days that it took to become successful. I think that the Soviet Union was somewhat surprised, but they recognized immediately the opportunity, and Amin, I think, making the right decision for himself, at least, and his party, sought to tie themselves to the Soviet Union in order to maintain their viability, because this particular party did not have a broad base of political support. Amin recognized that he would be unable to bring in the various elements of the Afghan society, other political elements, into the government and yet survive, have the Khalq Party or the Communist Party and himself survive. He therefore relied very heavily on the Soviet Union to be able to maintain himself in power. And opposed to this particular government were the majority of the people of Afghanistan. And what ensued was a civil war that was spearheaded primarily by a group of people called the Freedom Fighters, or the Mujahideen, and about which you read in the newspaper from time to time, scoring this particular kind of victory, or having this experiencing this particular kind of defeat, or making statements from out of Pakistan with regards to their opposition to the Soviet occupation. Actually, they were fighting a civil war with the Amin government even before the Soviet occupation of their country, and by November of last fall had reached a position where the Amin government was able to control only 3 major cities in that country, and most of the countryside was controlled by the Afghan freedom fighters. It was obvious to most analysts that if the state of affairs continued as they were, and if the Soviet Union did not send more than the 10,000 to 15,000 military advisors that they had in Afghanistan already, that the Amin government and this particular experiment in communism or socialism would fail. And so Amin began asking in August of last year for an increase in military support from the Soviet Union, in both personnel and sophisticated weaponry. The Soviet Union agreed to do that based on a number of conditions, which would diminish the control of the Afghan government over the military, the Soviet military, and the control of the Afghan government over the weaponry. Amin would not accept these conditions. And so the Soviets played ball with him as he, or at least made it appear that he was playing ball with him as he requested. What happened was, of course, that the Soviet Union did bring all of these soldiers into Afghanistan, and over Christmas of last year, 100,000 troops essentially, and of course they said that they came in at the invitation of the government of Afghanistan. Well, that to me is somewhat of an absurdity. Here we have a situation where we're talking like the mouse inviting the cat to come in and devour it, because as soon as the Soviets gained control over Afghanistan, or moved in with his troops, the first thing they did was to take Mr. Amin out and execute him, and bring in Mr. Karmal, who had been Amin's opponent in the past, and who had split from, or had been forced out of Afghanistan after their successful coup in 1978 by Amin in order for Amin to consolidate his own Khalq party. So he was off in Czechoslovakia at this time as ambassador, and then later he was fired as ambassador and was living in Czechoslovakia at the time that the coup, or that the Soviet occupation occurred. And so a broadcast stemmed from the Soviet Union with Mr. Karmal's voice on it, which was taped, saying, "I have requested the Soviets to come in and help us remove the elements of the imperialist forces," alleging that Mr. Amin and his associates were tied into the CIA. And he came in and then was named the president of Afghanistan along with his Parchami friends. Now that's sort of a chronology of what happened. I presented the background involving Daoud and these people because I think it's important to know that this just didn't happen overnight, that the Soviets had a role in Afghanistan. They had a very active role in the development of that country, just as the United States did. The Cold War development experiences that we shared, both the United States and the Soviet Union, saw the Soviet Union contributing somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 billion worth of aid, and the United States one half that. And so there was a big involvement. The University of Nebraska, for example, had a contract in Afghanistan, as did other universities, Columbia, Indiana, Wyoming, and various, and another group of universities within a consortium. So there were these presences of other countries in Afghanistan. It was sort of interesting to see the way the Soviets and the Americans would cooperate in developmental schemes having to do with Afghanistan. Paving of roads, they take one section, we take another. Development of agricultural schemes, etc. They take one region having to do with wheat there, and we'll take the one down here. And it was very interesting where, you know, a panel of individuals, Afghans, Soviets, and Americans, and maybe somebody from the United Nations would sit in the Ministry of Planning of Afghanistan and decide how the monies that were provided by these various donor countries and agencies would be split up and to which priorities they would be directed for development. So it's not, it wasn't something, you know, in which the Soviet Union all of a sudden decided they wanted to take Afghanistan. There was a long history of involvement there of a different kind. But what did occur, of course, was that the Soviet Union was presented with a situation where Afghanistan became, as they called it, a member of the socialist world. And the Soviet Union, as you know, had been following a policy which was enunciated in 1968 following the invasion or the occupation or reoccupation or whatever we call this move into Czechoslovakia to oust Dubček and his political colleagues as the Brezhnev Doctrine. And the interesting thing about this is that with Afghanistan, we have the first application of the Brezhnev Doctrine outside of Eastern Europe into Central Asia. And it is my belief that the real reason that the Soviets invaded and occupied Afghanistan was because they were determined not to see Afghanistan slip from the socialist world. And we have, of course, a number of other possible causes for this. For example, the Soviet concern of having another militant Muslim regime on its southern border, just like the one that had been instituted under Khomeini in Iran. And I think that that's a part of it, but I really think that the basic reason had to do with the desire not to see this regime in Afghanistan, which was obviously going to fall in the civil war, civil fighting there, to the freedom fighters. And so they decided to come in as they did. Now the question is, did they bite off more than they could chew? Did they make a mistake? Or who made the real mistake? My own feeling is that the Soviet Union knew well what it was doing. It was faced essentially in the United States with a government that was somewhat indecisive in the conducting of its foreign policy in most of the world. It was a government, an administration that was occupied by the so-called Iranian crisis. I call it the so-called Iranian crisis because I think the real crisis in Iran will come after the hostage issue is resolved. It was a country whose foreign policy was, I think, single-mindedly narrowed to the success of what we call the SALT agreements. Now, I for one, am a strong proponent of the idea of strategic arms limitation. And I'm not, unlike candidate Reagan, a believer that we have in the past necessarily bargained away all of our military chips. I think that, however, we need to have these particular kinds of agreements and these particular kinds of objectives put in more of a global perspective. And we had in our State Department at the time an individual by the name of Marshall Schulman, who was the primary advisor to the president and to Cyrus Vance on Soviet affairs. Now he, if you do not know anything about him, is a colleague of Zbigniew Brzezinski, both from the same university, from the same Department of Political Science. And they are colleagues only in profession, not in the views they share, nor in their personal relationship. I think it's interesting to point out that the first individual that Cyrus Vance appointed to the State Department's cadre, after he was named Secretary of State, and he was the first individual named by Carter to his cabinet, was Marshall Schulman. And most people believe that they did this because the second person that Carter appointed to his cabinet-level officialdom was Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Vance understood, being a knowledgeable bureaucrat, that he would have to be bargaining with Brzezinski throughout the whole period that they were in the administration for the president's ear on most affairs. And of course we have here then the beginning of what I considered a natural development towards a narrow consideration in foreign policy that would focus primarily on the big power balance. And while I think, again, this is an important thing for us to be concerned about at all times, we need to put these things in global perspective. We need to be able to keep focus on situations happening in Afghanistan and Iran and other parts of the world without becoming handcuffed, so that we're always in the position of reacting to events. Now, during the last year, prior to the time that the Soviets occupied Afghanistan, I used to go with a number of individuals who had been ambassadors to Afghanistan from the United States in the past to talk to people in the administration. We went up all the way through everybody in the State Department, and we eventually met twice with Vice President Mondale, and we indicated that we believed that that the Soviet Union would eventually have over 100,000 troops in Afghanistan by the spring of 1980. Now, we were saying this in the spring of 1979. We did not predict that the Soviet Union would occupy Afghanistan in December or at Christmas time, or they would do it in that fashion. We felt that they would wind up being sort of the de facto occupiers of Afghanistan through the invitation of the then Cherokee government, which was primarily controlled by Mr. Amin. We were met with sort of incredulous stares and comments rejecting this particular sort of theory. And it's one that, I was somewhat uncomfortable with because it made me sound like a born-again hawk, as we say. And as one who grew up in the sort of Kennedy era and then thereafter in the period of the 60s, etc., I found myself not exactly comfortable with this, but yet I felt very strongly that the situation in Afghanistan was very ripe to this kind of thing because we had not addressed American interest in many areas of the world, many regions of the world, in the conducting of our foreign policy over the last decade. We had gone from sort of the Big Bang approach to foreign policy under Henry Kissinger, where we had a lot of headlines and a lot of developments of things here and there, but nothing that seemed to stay with us, and that in a sense brought us Iran and Cambodia, to a point of what I consider a period of masterful indecision under Cyrus Vance. And I really believe that had the United States had the opportunity, had taken advantage of opportunities presented to it in last year, that we might have been able to preclude the occupation of Afghanistan. Now I'm going to leave that open to the questioning. You might want to question why I believe that, and I'd like to leave a few things to be unanswered. I was going to show some slides, but we're having a little trouble with the machine. I think I just tried to cover that in some of the things I said, Jim, so we're not going to need the slides, huh? And I've spoken here for about an hour, and I guess that's the amount of time I was to have. And I'll stay here until you run out of questions, okay? Any questions? Yes?
Freelance journalist David Klein was here last week.
I know David.
Spoke on Afghanistan. And he said that after the invasion, there was a political change in the U.S. and around the world. That change being that World War III is no longer an unthinkable topic. It's very thinkable, and it's being very openly discussed. And they're talking about winnability. They said that Afghanistan, the invasion, was sort of a signal for the 80s. Do you share that view?
Well, did everybody hear the question? Okay. Can you hear me if I don't use the mic? Can everybody hear me? No? Okay. I'll continue using the mic. The question was that last week, David Klein, a freelance journalist and a man whom I know fairly well, was here to speak on the same topic. I think it's sort of interesting that in the same town in rural Iowa, it's almost as unusual as having a Center for Afghanistan Studies in Omaha, Nebraska, you have two individuals speaking on the topic of Afghanistan, a place that hardly anybody had heard of before the Soviets occupied the country. I remember when we first said we were going to go to Afghanistan, people thought we were going to Africa. When we came back the first time, my wife was wearing an Afghan coat, and a lady came up to her and said, "Where'd you get that coat?" And she said, "Well, I got this in Afghanistan." The lady said, "Oh, is that new boutique around the corner?" In any case, here you're beset with two individuals within the space of 1 week coming to talk to you about this country that had only we only had passing glimpses of, and say maybe the movie The Man Who Would Be King, or Rudyard Kipling's writings, or maybe now something like The Far Pavilions. And he suggested, as you said, that with the invasion or an occupation of Afghanistan, that we were beginning an era in which people were considering the fact that the Third World War, a Third World War, was a real possibility, and indeed it was being talked about in various circles politically around the world. I've talked to David about this particular topic, and indeed I think there is an element of truth about this. One of the things I think is very interesting is here we have a president who came on nationwide television after the Soviet Union occupied a country that was non-aligned, that was, for all intents and purposes, in any case, at least at that time, a pro-Soviet satellite or a pro-Soviet client state, and a country that was certainly no threat to the internal security of the Soviet Union. They came in, and of course, they occupied this, and our president would come on national television and admit that he had learned more about the Soviet Union in the previous several days than he had learned about the Soviet Union in all the days of his life prior to that. And you know, what he was saying, of course, is that not only is he born again in his religion, but he's also born again in his approach to foreign policy. I truly feel that Jimmy Carter did not anticipate that this would happen, because I know that Marshall Schulman was absolutely aghast at this particular occupation. He had been telling individuals like myself throughout the last 2 years that he felt that if you dealt with the Soviet Union reasonably, and I'm not saying that particular theory is absolutely false, but I like to add conditions and caveats to it. If you dealt with the Soviet Union reasonably, that they would respond in a reasonable fashion. I think, quite frankly, what we need to understand in our foreign policy is that if you give a particular country, or any individual an opening in a poker game, they're going to take advantage of that. And I think we did that particular thing with the Soviet Union. We were forced to react to a confrontation that was stimulated by the fact that we had not, I think, effectively enunciated our interests in that part of the world prior to that time. And so as a result, perhaps maybe we are closer to a confrontation that might spark something like the Third World. I do not, Third World War. However, I do not subscribe to what I think David has said, and that is that people are becoming resigned to the fact that there's going to be a Third World War. I'm just too optimistic, maybe naive and foolish an individual to believe that that's the case. I certainly hope that I'm correct, obviously. I think that we encourage, however, the kinds of confrontations and that will promote the kinds of reactions that could lead to something like that if we do not articulate our interests. Those of you who study or who are scholars of political science enjoy, I think, in presenting the idea of foreign policy development or the whole idea of foreign policy as somewhat of an interesting combination of circumstances towards the development of various aims and interests of a country. But it's not all that complex when you understand what your interests are in various regions of the world, and you try and bring those in line to the extent that you can with the various countries in those regions, and then conduct policy from there. When I think what we have failed to do really is to pay the appropriate amount of attention to various regions of the world. At the same time, we are very deeply interested in other specific considerations. And as a result of that, we put ourselves, and I think, in a vulnerable position that does promote misunderstanding, adventurism, in effect, in what has gone on in Afghanistan, therefore confrontation and possible reaction, which I think is dangerous. Yes?
When you were finished up there, you said that the United States failed to take advantage of certain situations that would have resulted in a supposedly different Afghanistan today.
I thought you'd never ask.
Could you elaborate on some of the situations, what advantage they failed to take up? And are you suggesting that a U.S. occupation of
What I'm talking about is primarily a political and diplomatic kind of thing. I don't feel that the United States could viably be involved, particularly in terms of military personnel in Afghanistan. It's a landlocked country. In order to get into Afghanistan, we'd either have to go through the Soviet Union or Iran or Pakistan. The only option that remains viable to us right now is, of course, Pakistan. And quite frankly, the instability of that country, I think, turns off that particular kind of consideration. Throughout the last 2 years, throughout the year and 3 quarters prior to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, there was a considerable amount of brutality, even genocide, being practiced in Afghanistan, in which the Soviets were participating, for which we did not have, I suppose, on-the-spot witnesses like Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather or people of that nature who were able to be on the spot in Vietnam. And as a result, there was not much attention drawn to this particular thing, neither by our media nor by our government. But we had information, and since most of that information has been confirmed, that there was systematic execution going on of various political personages in Afghanistan, that various villages that were harboring Afghan freedom fighters were in the beginning subjected to search and destroy missions, and then later on, when that wasn't successful, they were just bombed off the face of the earth. And there were as many as 5,000 to 10,000 individuals, civilians, who were eliminated in those particular forays, bombing forays into central Afghanistan. And individuals would come out of the country with these particular kind of stories. We didn't have to, I suppose, cite the specifics, but I think that one of the things that I found very interesting after the Soviet occupation was the reaction of the Third World and the what I call the world's public forum, the United Nations. And I think that if the United States had put enough emphasis on a continuing public discussion of what was going on in that country at that particular time, that there might have been enough diplomatic attention focused there too, that the Soviets might have refrained from building up the kinds of military, having the kind of military buildup on the Afghan border that eventually brought about the occupation. I'm not the only person who shares that belief, by the way. Malcolm Toon, the former ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union, suggested the same thing during all of last year before he was relieved of his post, and so did these ambassadors to Afghanistan, and so did the American mission in Afghanistan, which remained there after the assassination, or the kidnapping, and then the killing of the American ambassador to Afghanistan. So I'm not suggesting that we should have been involved militarily. I'm suggesting that had we made these statements, however, and this is the military side of this, that the support that the freedom fighters would have enjoyed from the Arab countries in the Gulf, from China, from Pakistan, and particularly Egypt. And Egypt and China are the two most important linkages here, because they have a surplus of Soviet military weaponry. And the weaponry that the Afghan freedom fighters are using is indeed Soviet. And because the Soviet military was trained in Afghanistan, when the Afghan military was because it was trained in the Soviet Union, these individuals, having mutinied, brought with them their Soviet military hardware, and they were able to train the freedom fighters in the use of these particular things. So we had interchangeable parts possibly here. So I think that through my own experiences with diplomats from both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia during that period, that they were looking for the United States to conduct some kind of statements politically that might have encouraged them, because they were afraid that the Soviet Union would, in a sense, bring about for them some kind of trouble, political blackmail, or something of this nature that would have precluded them from getting so involved. Now, you might ask what kind of things the Soviet Union could do with either Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. For Pakistan, in August of 1978, the Soviet Union established camps in Afghanistan for Baluchis from Pakistan to come to be trained in guerrilla warfare and dissident activities, so that they could go back into Pakistan as a fifth column in the Baluchistani area. So it's very easy for the Soviets to help to maintain the instability of one of the two most unstable countries in the world today, the other being Iran. So, the Soviet Union put itself in the position in Afghanistan to take advantage of a situation where they probably not have to consider further military expeditions, because they have a very stable environment in which to operate. Now, I don't know if that's the kind of answer you were. We will never know exactly whether or not diplomatic endeavors, whether levied either through quiet or more open approaches, would have been successful.
Basically, you're just saying that it should have been more press release, more discussion in public forum as far as what's going on in Afghanistan. You're not talking about arm and the freedom fighters.
Well, you know, the freedom fighters really can't use American weaponry at this stage.
Did the freedom fighters gain support in Iran before the Shah was imposed? I mean, since Iran borders on Afghanistan, were they receiving American support through the Iranian government?
There isn't that I have any evidence that if they were getting anything, it was substantial. Actually, if you remember at that time, from April of '78 until the downfall of the Shah was just a matter of months, and he himself was very actively trying to keep things stable there. So he wasn't really in a position to do much to bring about some change there. The support that the Afghans did get, by the way, was primarily through the making of weapons in Pakistan. There's a tremendous arms industry in what we would call cottage industry, small arms making. And the Afghans essentially were equipped with Lee Enfield rifles that were made there and as copies of the Lee Enfield in Pakistan. But I think we didn't really, do you remember really during the period 1978 to the time that the Soviets occupied that we really brought Afghanistan into the headlines? The only time that was really brought into the headlines is when our ambassador was killed, or when, as a matter of fact, I can't think of anything else. There wasn't much concern raised in the press. It was, you know, now and again an article, but you didn't hear Cyrus Vance. Cyrus Vance was very concerned about détente and SALT at that time. He did not want to believe, really, that the Soviet Union, I think, would want to do the kinds of things that it did in Afghanistan, because he recognized that would mean the end of what he had laid as his basic foundation for the epitaph that he wanted on his political tombstone.
But basically, you don't get anything about the Field Girls public press. I mean, the Field Girls are basically ignored.
That's right.
Regardless of Afghanistan or South Korea.
That's right.